Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, what I hope will be a delightful evening. I'm Genevieve Lemoyne. I'm the curator and the registrar of the Peary Macmillan Arctic Museum. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome Gary Phillips here tonight. Gary is the author of this amazing book, Matthew Henson and the Ice Temple of Harlem. And he's here for the museum's first ever fiction reading and book discussion. When I first heard about this book, I was very intrigued. Matthew Henson has long been a hero of mine. In fact, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who knows anything about Arctic exploration who isn't a great admirer of Matthew Henson. He seems an ideal candidate for the role that Gary has placed him in these books, a kind of crime-fighting hero. And so I was, of course, very interested to see how Gary would handle this development in Matthew's career. By way of introduction, and I just want to point out that, of course, Matthew is here listening to all that we're saying, and he also has very much enjoyed these new developments. So Gary is the critically acclaimed author of 18 novels, among them the Ivan Monk mystery series, which I have not read yet, but I'm looking forward to dipping into soon. Numerous graphic novels, short stories, novellas. He's written for television, such as the FX crime series Snowfall, and has edited anthologies, including the award-winning Obama Inheritance. Both he and his writing have been described as the epitome of noir cool. He was drawn on his early love for classic hard-boiled pulp fiction, but with a really significant and important contemporary edge that's been informed by his community-based activism in his hometown of Los Angeles, from where he is joining us today. It's a long way from there to New York during the Harlem Renaissance, and even farther to northern Greenland. But I hope you'll agree with me that in Mr. Phillips' hands, it's a trip definitely worth making. I'm going to hand things over to him now, because I know you're here to listen to him, not to me. And so, Gary, welcome to Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, and the Arctic Museum virtually.
Genevieve, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all reaching out. I have to say, of course, at first I thought maybe, when I saw the title, the Peary Macmillan Arctic Museum, I thought, well, it's one of my buddies playing a joke on me, knowing the somewhat antagonistic relationship, or the rocky relationship that I guess eventually developed between Commander Perry and Matthew Henson. But nonetheless, I'm so pleased to be here this evening. So I think we've discussed kind of the format for today, or for tonight. I guess it's tonight for you guys. It's 3 hours later where you all are. Is I'm going to talk a little bit about how the book came about, because here I've taken this actual real life person and reimagined, reconfigured them in the sort of pulp tradition of Doc Savage and Indiana Jones, and talk about that a little bit, how that came to be, a little bit more, something about the setting, as well as what kind of propels the plot and the subplots of the book. And then I will read, not for long, I will read a fairly brief passage, which will be the sort of from the intro chapter when we first meet Matthew. And then hopefully by then, if the audience out there hasn't been bored to tears, we can get into some questions and answers, or just slings and barbs. So I've known about Matthew Henson for a very long time. I think, I think maybe, what was the book called? Was it called Dark Companion? I think maybe that was on my dad's bookshelf. Maybe, and this is years ago. And although I never read it, but I knew about him from I guess just sort of anecdotal stories, and different things I would come across now and then. But then, as Genevieve mentioned, I'm mostly a crime fiction writer. That's more or less what it is that I write in various forms. But anyway, but I've also dipped my toe a little bit in what is now called new pulp, which is to say, without going down the long tributary about that, which is to say that several pulp characters, as people might know, from the 30s, before we had internet and 24/7 media at our fingertips, you actually used to have to read to get your entertainment, and this is even before radio programs were really kind of creating serials. So particularly in the early 30s, there were pulp magazines, right? And first they were sold for a dime, and then eventually, I guess, 25 cents. But you could buy a pretty thick magazine, and it was called pulp because it was printed on really cheap paper. It had four-color garish covers, of course, to get you to buy it, because there's a whole ton of them arrayed at your corner newsstand. But these were put out by various publishers, Street and Smith being one of the bigger ones. And there was this spawned various characters: the Shadow, Doc Savage, the Spider, etc., who became very popular. And at one point, in fact, Walter Gibson, who wrote The Shadow, was writing at least two, what they call novel length, which usually meant between 50 to 60,000 words. But he was writing at least two novel length stories about the Shadow each month. And not only would you get the lead feature, you would get these backup features with all these short stories. Sometimes these short stories were actually written by the lead writer, but they would also use various aliases, just because they didn't want to overkill it with just using their name. So they would make it seem as if they had all these various writers contributing to the magazine. All right, so there you have it. So there's kind of like that era of the pulp, and now some of those characters, going way up to modern times, have now in fact fallen into public domain. Not the Shadow and Doc Savage. In fact, there's, I guess, an effort now to do a Doc Savage cable show. But some of the other characters who the publishers have gone out of existence are kind of just sort of floating out there. And so now you have what in the old days would have been fan fiction, is now people taking these characters, writing new adventures about them, and then and there's several publishers which have now brought out these various stories and various anthologies and novels and what have you. But I wasn't interested, and I've done a little bit of that. But in this case, as I said, I've known about Matthew Henson for some time, and I just started to think more about him as a character. And as we do here in the West, we often reinvent our public figures. Wild Bill Hickok, Annie Oakley, Belle Starr, who've been the subjects of various, we've seen them have been played by characters in films from the 30s to the 40s up till now. Deadwood comes to mind, of course, as another example of this, where you've taken real life people and really just reimagined them and really reconstructed them for the modern era in a lot of, sometimes in a kind of retro way. So I thought, as I thought more about this, I started to then say, well, I should really kind of learn something else about Matthew Henson, other than him just being one of the, I guess, six it was. It was him, Perry, and four Inuit gentlemen whose names I have here, and I use them in the book, particularly Uta, who particularly became a pretty close friend to Henson, and so I thought, well, okay. So I knew that he had written this. It's not really a autobiography, but it's really, I guess, more of a memoir of that time. It's called a Negro Explorer at the North Pole, which I believe, and I'm sure Genevieve or somebody can correct me, but I believe it was published in 1912, because I think they reached the pole in 1909, as I recall. This was like was it the sixth or eighth attempt? It was several attempts to reach the pole, and they finally reached it. Anyway, so okay, so I'd never read. I didn't have that book, or I thought I had a copy of the book laying around, but I couldn't find it. So I get another copy of the book, because it's been, again, it's in public domain, so I think it's been reprinted various times. And I read that book, and it's okay. It's a little tame for my purposes, but it was at least informative, right? And it told me something about some of the technical things I needed to know about that certainly that time period, and certainly that part of northern Greenland, and all the trials and tribulations they had gone through to finally reach the pole. But it just so happens that that particular version of that particular edition of the book had a very interesting introduction by a professor, S. Allen Counter. And Counter's intro suggested that there was more to the story than what Henson, or maybe Henson and his editor, had let on in that 1912 edition. And in fact, then Counter talked about some of the interviews that Henson did, where he certainly seemed to be much more frank and forthcoming about his and Perry's at times somewhat rocky relationship, as well as his relationship with others on the expeditions. Him being the only black man on the expedition, though there were, of course, other people of color in terms of the Inuit who worked on the expeditions as well. But as I found out, Henson was the one who learned to speak the Inuit language, or some of the Inuit languages. He was the one that did a lot of the repairs, etc. So I thought, well, okay, now it's starting to be, we're starting to fill in some of these blanks here. And so I mentioned S. Allen Counter had done this very interesting introduction to Henson's book. So then I went and got S. Allen Counter's book, North Pole Legacy, Black, White, and Eskimo. And sure enough, in his book, which is not, as far as I know, there's no edition of Henson's book that mentions this. It turns out that both Perry and Henson had Inuit offspring. I believe Henson was married twice, though as far as I understand, he didn't have children here in the States, or children by those unions, but he did certainly have a son, by his relationship, his union with a woman, an Inuit woman in Greenland, and I think Perry had two children. I believe he had a son and a daughter, and I think the daughter dies somewhat young. I think she reaches adulthood, but I think she dies somewhat young. Anyway, in Counter's book, which was written in the 80s, he goes back to that part of Greenland, to that village, and sure enough, finds the two sons, who at that point were in their 80s, and in fact brings them back to the States, and they're feted and all this sort of stuff, and they obviously they remember, because they on the real, they never saw their fathers again, right? They knew who they were, and of course they heard stories about them, but they never, as far as I understand, never in fact encountered them at any other time, other than when they were very, very small. I mean, infants, and of course would not remember anything about them from that time period. But nonetheless, Counter talks about this, and he talked about some other aspects of what went on with those various expeditions, because he went and looked at or read through the various diaries that the folks on the expeditions kept, and assembled some pretty interesting facts, I thought. And as I think we were talking about a little earlier, then I learned that sure enough, when at one of the expeditions, when they're up there in the north, and they see the folks using various iron tools, they're kind of like, well, wait a minute, there's no iron deposits up in this part of Greenland, so where's that coming from? And sure enough, there was this meteorite, and they assumed that they presumed that it had crashed there more than 10,000 years ago, and there's a lot of huge pieces of it laying around. And they, they've been obviously using some of it then for to make tools and what have you. And then at some point, the expedition hauls back three of the big massive pieces to the Natural History Museum to help raise money to further more expeditions. But once I had that part, then I had, okay, so now I've got the sun, I've got the meteorite, I've got I'm going to tell this story because it's kind of a good story, and I've got this one great story that, and maybe maybe it's somewhat maybe counters reading more into it than what really happened. But as one can imagine, on those expeditions, him being the only black man on expeditions, uh, some of the members of the expeditions used the N word freely. And apparently there was a gentleman from Kentucky. Now Henson does mention this guy in his book. In Negro Explorer the Oracle, he mentions him, but he mentions him very, very much in passing. But there was a particular gentleman who Henson butted heads with. And he was on one of the expeditions. And when their ship, the Roosevelt, returned to New York Harbor, everybody gets off the ship except this guy. This guy's not there. So they're asked Henson, and I think Uta is there with him, and I think maybe Eganwald, which was Uta's brother. Anyway, Henson and a couple of the Inuit guys are asked this question, like, what happened to this guy? We'll just call him Mr. Smith. That's not his real name, but what happened to Smith? And they said, well, we warned him, but he went out on the out on the ice one day, and we think he fell into a crevasse. Now, maybe that's true. Maybe that is really happened. Now, Counter seems to suggest that Mr. Smith might have butted heads with Mr. Henson once too often and paid the price. Who knows? But nonetheless, it's a if it's a fable, it's a fairy tale. Okay, fine. But nonetheless, it was great grist for what I needed in terms of helping them to form what would be this story. Now, I should point out for anybody who has an interest in reading the book, as Genevieve hinted at, the book is not set in the Arctic. It's not. It takes place in 1928. So it takes place at the right before what will be, of course, the crash of Wall Street in '29. But it takes place during the Harlem Renaissance. Now, because I'm reimagining Matthew Henson, I shaved off. I don't quite tell you his age, but I've shaved off several years of the real Matthew Henson. I mean, his actual age there in the 20s, and he actually did live in Harlem. When he returned, he's from Baltimore, but he actually did wind up living in Harlem, and he at one point, I think he retires actually as a clerk with the U.S. Customs House. A fairly modest outcome, I thought, for a man of his talents. But nonetheless, in my story, it's set in the Harlem Renaissance, which was a kind of very vibrant, intellectual, political time in Harlem. Some of those figures from that time period, Langston Hughes and Du Bois, and some others are mentioned. But in particular, because again, I'm a crime writer, and because I wanted to have a kind of exciting plot to get this story rolling. When we first meet Mr. Henson, he's been employed by what today, or what my dad would call, my dad was from Texas, what my dad would call a jackleg preacher. But in those days, there were several kind of these spiritualist slash con man leaders. There was a guy named Daddy Grace, and there was another one named Father Divine. And they did do these, they did wonderful things. They argued for justice and equality, but they were also somewhat hyperinflated. They created their own myths. But I was always fascinated by those kind of characters. So I created a character called Daddy Paradise. And Daddy Paradise has hired Henson to essentially fetch, to help bring back his grown daughter, who's been kidnapped by Dutch Schultz. Now, Dutch Schultz, of course, was a real figure, a real gangster of that time period, and true to that time period, Dutch Schultz is trying to muscle in on the numbers racket, which was well, it was born of the old Italian lottery, but came from Harlem, and it was controlled by Harlem gangsters. And in particular, I use Stephanie St. Clair, who was known as Queenie St. Clair, another real figure from history, and she's running her part of the numbers racket, and she and Dutch Schultz, of course, are not only just butting heads, but they're trading bullets, and so the plot kicks in motion when Henson retrieves the grown daughter who's been kidnapped, and then other things are revealed, and again, not to give too much away, but then Nikola Tesla shows up, which why not? And then Bessie Coleman, who was another real figure from history, who was in fact the first black woman to get her aviator license in the States. But it should be pointed out, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that in fact, um, Bessie had to go to France to take her aviation classes because um, no aviation school in America at the time would take a black woman on. And so, but she persevered, and in real life, in fact, I mean, Bessie dies pretty young. In fact, she dies in the year that the book is set, from a plane accident. But that doesn't stop you when when you're recreating history. So all these characters kind of find their way into the book, and there's a sort of bigger, larger plot is revealed, and I guess I'll just say a couple more things about that, and I'll do this little bit of the reading here. But the larger plot that's revealed is again something that I plucked uh, it's from another time period in history, but it is alleged that during the administration of FDR, as bringing us out of the Great Depression, that there were it was alleged to have been called the business plot, and this was supposedly then a plot actually originating out here in California, from what we would now call right-wing forces, who essentially then tried to recruit this decorated general, Smedley Butler, and it's Butler who talks about this, and who attempted to recruit this general so as to then uh, plot a coup and then to overthrow FDR, and to install their own sort of president. Now, this has again been seen as very fanciful on the part of Butler, who himself had a very interesting and colorful career. But the plot, as in fact, has shown up in actually in a couple of various incarnations in other fictions. So I sort of take a little bit of that and sprinkle that into the mix as well. So I guess all that to say is that I had a lot of great fun writing this book. As I said, obviously it is not uh, it is not history. It is as I've used the quote from the man who shot Liberty Valance. When history and the legend collide, print the legend. So I'm definitely in this case printing the legend. But I think even in the context of this somewhat fantastic tale, I tried to at times, incorporate real figures from history, real historical moments from history. I talk a little bit about Marcus Garvey had already been excised, had already been deported by 28, but I talk about that. So I talk about some of the forces and some of the actual people and personalities that I think were very instrumental in helping to shape this time period, um, in American life. And really in the end of it, I suppose it's really kind of my love song to Matthew Henson, who I think by a lot of different accounts was certainly never given the accolades that would due him. Let alone, by the way, the four Inuit gentlemen, as well. And in fact, to Professor Counter's credit, who I believe has also passed away now, uh, when he when he brought the two surviving sons back, who were at that point, as I said, elderly, to the states, one of his efforts was to petition then President Ronald Reagan to have Henson reinterred his graveyard in his native Baltimore to be at Arlington Cemetery with full honors. And in fact, this was done. So really, I mean, so at least there was some modicum of recognition of the man's efforts. And I should mention, very quickly, one of the other things that helped fire my imagination about using Henson was he really did have a kind of Dickens-like existence. He, as in a Dickens novel, fled a kind of cruel stepmother at the age of 12 from D.C. And he's 12. I mean, he's a kid, and and by hook and by crook, he makes his way back to the docks of Baltimore and signs on. I mean, even then he was too young to be a cabin boy, and yet he's able to sign on to the Katie Hines, the ship, the kindly Captain Childs, who's the captain, and by all accounts they have a wonderful existence in terms of the captain, teaching him some of the classics and teaching him naval navigation and all these sort of things. And he got to see as a kid, as just a child, really a teen, these various ports and various lands. So again, that was just something that I just thought was so wonderful and so rich that I just had to use it and extrapolate even more. So in my version, this happens, but in what also happens is in the 20s, early 20s, Henson stays in parts of Asia to then learn martial arts, and this is then incorporated in his in his physical efforts in the book. And even that's not so crazy because, as people may know, recently there's been some. I guess there's talk of a feature film, but there's a book. I think the book already came out, and it's about this person named Yasuki. I think Yasuki was a real person who, in the 15th century, a black man, became a samurai in feudal Japan. So there are stories to be told, and there are strange and wonderful uh, reveals to be had in this world. So in some small way, I suppose. I mean, obviously, I'm telling you a fanciful, fantastic tale, but I hope I've grounded it to some extent in a kind of reality of the time and the reality of who Matthew Henson was. And I'll just say one more thing before I read this little passage. As it turns out, and I only knew this once I finished the book, I thought one of the traits I wanted to give Henson was that that he would walk around a lot without a coat on because he was so used, to all those long Arctic winters, that the cold of New York and having been in New York in the cold, it is cold there. I don't know if it gets as cold as Maine, but it's cold enough for me. Being a California kid, I can't take it. And sure enough, I read something really in passing. It wasn't in Counter's book. It wasn't in Henson's book, but I read something not that long ago. And sure enough, it turned out that, as I said, Henson lived in Harlem until 55. I believe he passes at 55. He apparently would be seen in the winters without a coat on and not bothered at all by the cold. So that was a great little, I guess, symbiotic thing that I incorporated to my version of the character that turned out to be accurate. All right, so having said all that, and hopefully not lost everybody, I'm going to read a brief introduction passage that gives you kind of a sense of who Henson is, or my version of Henson, as well as what's going to happen in the book. Her tiny eyes blinked rapidly behind the heavy lenses of her glasses. She was on tiptoe looking through the peephole. Yes, she asked, frowning. Then, gasping in disbelief, my goodness, you're him, she exclaimed. I am, ma'am, said the voice familiar to many Harlemites. Bless your heart, she replied. Me and a few of my friends from Our Ladies Auxiliary enjoyed that talk and slideshow about the ancient library at Timbuktu you gave at First Baptist last year. Thank you. Would you mind if I use your living room window? Oh, yes, yes. Come on in, Mr. Henson. She unlatched the door and opened it wide. The elderly, light skinned black woman wore a quilted housecoat and slippers. Matthew Henson wasn't particularly tall, but at a shade under 6 feet, and what with his sturdy build, he gave the impression of being larger as he regarded the older woman's modest apartment. The diaphanous curtains were ironed, and bright white doilies were scattered about. There was a built in sideboard containing what he presumed were the dishes and silverware only brought out for her ladies' auxiliary meetings. You look loaded for bear, she said, eyes wide behind her glasses, noting his appearance. He filled the doorway in his working man's clothes. A rope knotted at several intervals connected to a grapple coiled around his substantial chest. There was also an ice axe, and ulu in the Intuit language, a small utility knife, and other such items attached to a custom made tool belt he had on. He came farther into the room, and the older lady quietly closed the door. I'm sorry to intrude on your quietude, Mrs. Silo. The late Mr. was a railroad man, old child. He traveled all over this country on them rails. She looked off toward a mantel with various framed photos on it, as well as a good sized Santa Fe Railroad enameled shield. Yes, ma'am, where would we be without the railroads? He eyed the window across the room, but wasn't going to rush things and make her more nervous, no matter what might be transpiring just below them. He'd learned long ago in far harsher climes to pace himself. Lord, yes, she went on, our people's means of freedom in many ways. Isn't that right? He prayed they weren't about to have a revival. That is so. He inched forward a notch. Would you like some tea? She offered, but instead of the kitchen, she glanced toward her sideboard and its lead glass cabinets. Though I imagine an outdoorsman like yourself might want something a mite more bracing. About that there window, Mrs. Selo. Oh, yes, she started as if waking from slumber. You didn't come here to chit chat. Maybe some other time when the clock's not against me. She beamed up at him. Really? Would you come speak to the auxiliary as my special guest? I would be delighted. The ladies would be beside themselves, Mr. Henson. Matt will do. She clapped her hands together appreciatively. Fine, fine. He went on past her to the window. He undid the lock and slid it up easily. After moving her easy chair and lamp aside, he secured his pronged grapple hook on the frame and sill. The sharp ends dug into the wood and would have leave gouge marks, but there was no helping that. Mrs. Selo didn't raise a fuss, being too polite, he figured. Is this a government mission, Mr. Mack? The widow asked as he put a leg outside the open window. No, this is a private engagement, Mrs. Selo. I see, she said, her dubiousness evident. Henson was aware that there was a persistent rumor that many believed he was an operative for an outfit called the International Detective Agency. There was no such organization, but he knew the source had been a serialized story in a magazine several years ago called The Black Sleuth. Elements of the popular story got transferred from the page, as these things do, into speculation in conversations in cafes and beauty salons throughout Harlem and elsewhere. From there, over time, fiction took on the trappings of gossip, which always had its own reality. I'm thinking once you're gone, you're not coming back tonight. He was half out the window. Unlikely. How do I get in touch with you? She asked. Just leave word for me at May May's Diner. Over on Lennox? Yes, near 132nd. Now, if you would, once I'm outside, please don't go near the window, he added, figuring she might take a gander as he descended. He also hoped the bullets wouldn't be coming through to ruin her nice flooring from the story below. Very well, she said resignedly. He was depriving her of some of the excitement of having Matt Henson in her apartment, but she'd still have more than enough to tell her church ladies. His booted soles firm against the building's bricks, Henson, who'd slipped on supple seal-skin gloves, held himself in place on the rope a few inches below the older lady's window. He'd lowered the sash, cognizant the warmth of the day was giving way to the early evening, and not everyone liked the cold as he did. From where he was now, the window he wanted was below him to the left. He clambered down and cursed under his breath. The curtains were drawn. No way to tell what was going on inside, except a slight gap between the curtains showed the lights were on. Henson worked the rope around his veined forearm, holding his body in place. His other hand free, he got his axe loose. He had one of his miniature smoke bombs with him, as well as an incendiary type. The latter was based on a grenade developed by the Germans toward the close of World War I. He wasn't of a mind to start a fire in the room beyond, at least if he didn't have to, but better to be prepared. Henson clenched the axe handle between his teeth and, unlimbering the rope, got both hands on it as he slipped down again. He came to rest just above the curtain window, not worried if those inside detected movement or not. What had that blowhard Perry always barked? Find a way or make one, Henson. Well, shit. He smiled thinly as he pushed back once, twice, and on the third time, muttering, whoop, halloo, got enough arc as he swung back toward the building and let go of the rope. His boots and legs burst through the glass. Though it looked like he would land on his butt, the airborne Henson tucked his body into a roll, and he landed neatly in a ball. One side of the curtains ripped from its pole as the material caught the fold of his leg. A hood who'd been sitting in a chair eating a sandwich gaped at the unexpected visitor. He spat roast beef and tomato from his mouth, his hand darting for a 45 and a shoulder holster draped on the back of a chair. He got the gun in his fist, but too late. Henson was upright and springing on him. Damn it, the white gunman blared. Jump on this, Henson said as he punched the man in the side of his head. He stumbled sideways, dazed. A pocket door to another room slammed home. A second gunman in a garish tie came out, firing a drum-loaded Thompson machine gun. He raked the room in a sweep of bullets, hunks of wood, cloth, and porcelain flying everywhere as the rounds blistered furniture and exploded the bric-a-brac. Watch where you're shooting, Eddie, the one Henson had struck yelled. He crawled behind a wing-back chair. Ah, stop being a crybaby, Eddie groused. He looked around, not sure where their intruder had gone. There was a swinging door to the kitchen, and several bullet holes had penetrated that. That darky must be in there, said the first hood. He's as good as on the slab, Eddie said, starting forward, sending another round through the door. His companion, gun in hand, joined in. The door now hung loose, the plaster and frame now nearly non-existent. From inside the kitchen, it got kicked in all the way in and fell on the machine gunner. So there you go. There's a little bit of a exploding entrance to our retro pulp tale. So there you have it.
Well, that was a very exciting introduction to the book. It's a great scene. And now we can open it up to questions. I forgot to mention at the beginning, we won't be able to hear you, but you can certainly type your questions into the chat, and we will do our best to answer them. Not we.
Well, it could be we.
I will read your questions.
There we go.
And we actually have a couple of questions already in the Q&A section. And so we can start with those while people are still typing. And this is from Jamie. And he says, in the book, Henson's friendship and working relationship with Bessie Coleman is based on mutual respect between equals and seems very different from the usual portrayals of relations between men and women in pulp fiction. Why did you choose to write their friendship/partnership this way? And this is a very important part of the question, will Bessie return in a sequel?
Well, I'll answer. Yeah. Okay. So there's a two-part thing. I think as we talked a little bit about initially, or I talked a little bit about initially, you're right. I should have framed this a little better. Uh, People who are writing new pulp now, even though some of those stories are set in this time period, in late 20s into the 30s, even to the 40s. Clearly, though, we're writing from today's point of view. So absolutely, so it's absolutely correct that, and you're right. I wanted to get that up front because even there's a crack early on in the book where a buddy of his, oh, Bessie, and Henson's quick to say, no, no, we're pals. We're not. It's not like that. And so you're right. So that certainly in the old pulps, if you had although some women characters, there were some pretty tough women characters. Doc Savage had a cousin, Pat Savage, and she was pretty tough. And she could sock a man. And so you did have some tough women characters, even in the pulse. But generally speaking, you're right. There was very traditional kinds of roles. And certainly, if you had somebody of color, they were in the background, or they may be the waiter or the porter, that kind of thing. But they certainly weren't center stage. So obviously cognizant of that, and not cognizant that we're writing now from modern times, even though we're writing about then. And even though understanding that Henson is going to still have a certain perspective of a man of his age, a man of his time, I still wanted to give him as much as possible, modernize him, but not so much so that he was unrecognizable as a person of that time period. As to whether Bessie will return, I'm not sure. I have an idea for what will be the second, or maybe I have an idea for the second book, and I have an idea for the third book. I'm not sure that Bessie will be there, but if she isn't there, some other historical figures might well be on stage.
Right. And in fact, that is another question that we've got. Are there historical figures that you couldn't include in this one that are you willing to talk about any that you might be including in further issues?
Well, I think even the second outing for Henson, the one I have envisioned now, actually will take place in Los Angeles in 32. Partly because a lot of the pulp stories were always centered in the East. Certainly, Doc Savage and the Shadow had their headquarters in New York. Although they journeyed, particularly Doc, right? He journeyed all over the place. The Shadow mostly stayed in New York or New Jersey. But I was kind of curious because I've written a couple of short stories about Los Angeles in that time period in the 30s. And so I was kind of interested in bringing Matthew out here for that. And yes, I have in mind a couple of historical figures who might show up then, including Josephine Baker, the famed actress who went to fame in Paris, and in fact was a spy, right? In fact, worked during World War II for the French underground. But this would be before that. But some of those characteristics of that kind of person, that kind of personality, I'm very intrigued by. And she, of course, herself has been the subject of film, fictional film treatment. Although I don't know that she's shown up. I guess she's shown up in a couple of novels. I shouldn't say that. I think she has shown up in a couple of novels. But I think hopefully the way I'm going to use her will be a bit different and a fresh take on her as a character, as a personality.
So Susan is pointing out that she was struck by how many of the details about clothing and furnishings you have in the narrative, and she wonders what kind of research you continue to do to get all those details for that time.
Yeah, I guess the internet is both a boon and a danger, considering how many conspiracy theories it has helped to foster and foment. But be that as it may, there are aspects of the internet that are very useful that do in fact. Although my dad was a mechanic, my mom was a librarian, so I grew up going to libraries. I love libraries. I love just hanging around and finding books and old articles and what have you. And so there's some of that, right? But it does help that now you can go on the internet and you can ask a specific thing and you can say, well, what were fashions like in the late 20s, or women's fashion? What did men wear? And oh, by the way, it also helps, of course, that as a kid I grew up watching a lot of Jimmy Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, Humphrey Bogart movies, all these gangster movies, Warner Brothers gangster movies from the 30s. So a lot of that's sort of ingrained in my head, and some of the slang from that time period. So you can always go back and look at a snippet of this or that, and so that helped. And newsboy caps and newsy caps and that kind of thing, which they called skimmers, and so all that kind of stuff. I guess some of that's just in my head, populating, crowding in there. And then when you find certain things on the internet, it kind of helps to also it helps to differentiate what's useless information or stuff that's just made up versus stuff that's useful. And of course, and if you can, particularly if you can find ads from that time period, that kind of thing, that's always very helpful because you can just sort of look at that and you just try to figure out, well, how do I describe this in a fairly efficient way? But yes, absolutely. I think the look, the feel, because to some degree, you, the writer, of the set designer, right, the set dresser, you've got to help supply that for certainly for a generation of readers now who don't necessarily have any um, working knowledge of that time period.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I was very impressed with that kind of detail and the way that you managed to evoke the atmosphere.
Oh, good.
I
Yeah.
think it was really, really, nicely done, and I learned a lot actually. I
Good.
think.
Well, and I should say too, one of the books that I thought helped me a lot of ways in terms of, I mean, beyond Counter's book and Henson's book, where there's several books that are just kind of these oral histories, of the Harlem Renaissance of that time period, which I find are just great, right? Because you can all get the factual stuff, that's fine, but that's kind of somewhat dry. But if you just read about somebody who had to stand out on the, like a person who was like a house cleaner, but there was like these house cleaning services, and they would have to go find work every day or every other week or something like that. Things like that, or or how at that point, the union, the Communist Party was really strong in certain aspects, certainly strong in New York in terms of Communist Party USA, and those frictions, and just the movement for a decent wage, and what have you. Some of that I know just from some of my background, but then it always helps when you can read something, adds to the verisimilitude of some person's, personal account of that time period, them looking back. And not that you would do anything verbatim, I wouldn't steal their words, but it would help to put a picture in my mind. If I could put the picture in my mind, then hopefully then I can translate that in my words, to the page.
Mhm. Um, Liz Muther has asked, and I know because she and I have talked about this, she hasn't had time to read the book yet. So she wants to know how the sons of Henson and Peary, if they figure in the novel, and what happened to them historically after they came to the US, which.
I don't know. I mean, other than as I said, they were up in age then, and essentially, I mean, they got feted, got their gold watch, and went back home. But they and then there was actually great grandchildren, by then, right? So some of those descendants are still around. As I said, I do know that Perry's daughter had passed fairly. I want to say, well, I'm not sure when she passed, but I think it was. I think I want to say it was in the early '50s, 1950s, when she passed. Um, but I will say this: I'm glad Liz asked that question, because I failed to mention this. For the purposes of my book, um, to give Henson an emotional through line, you can have all the action, adventure, and all that stuff, and Nikola Tesla's death race. That's all good. That's all fine. But you've got the characters are living, breathing personalities, and so for the purposes of my book, he has come to regret being an absentee father. And I'm gonna butcher the kid's name, the son's actual name, but I use the son's actual name. I think it's Anaqua, Anaukaq.
Yeah,
However that's pronounced.
Anoka.
Anaqua. There we go. So in the book, for the purpose of my discussion, the kid is a teenager when Henson is thinking about, which actually would have been accurate in terms of his age. And so, and also in the book, I suggest that Henson has seen the kid more than once, that he has actually seen the child several times, but he has not seen him now for several years. And so one of the things that is pulling him through this book to finish his mission, to get out of it alive, is he wants to return to the North, because he understands that he can't, he understands what abandonment was like. He understands what it means to not have a parent, Captain Childs being his substitute father. And so now he understands that he needs to, at this stage of the young man's life, he needs to be there for him, and that's what's pushing him. That's what's propelling him to go back, to return to the North, and to fulfill that role, to take on that one more task that he should take on, that he is morally charged with doing it, and will do that. So all that to say is that in the second book, however I get around to writing it, the young man, the teenager, will be there, will play a role. He will have reunited with his son. There will not be all roses and bread and roses between them, but nonetheless, part of that story will be about them trying to bond as father and son.
And if you want some inspiration, we have photographs of Anelka at different ages.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I can send
That's wonderful. Oh, yes, I would love that. That would be wonderful.
So there's some more questions coming in. Meredith McEachern asks, this is a writing question. She says, I also really love the incorporation of historic detail in the story. Do you usually research and use your accumulated knowledge as you go, or do you prefer to get the plot and character and action beats down first and then fill in the details later?
Wow, that's a great question. Probably, I guess, like a lot of writers now, I guess the internet has given me a form of ADD. So I used to just sort of write the whole thing and then kind of plug in stuff. But now I find myself, as I'm writing, if I reach a point where I'm a little unclear on a detail, I will stop and I go look about the detail, and I plug in a little bit, and then but I want to keep going, because you're right, I want to kind of keep the flow going. But invariably, as I go through and start to do the rewrite, I will flag, a particular area or a particular question, and then try to then flesh that out, if that detail is important. But of course, then you have to be careful too, right? You don't want to, you don't want to do an information dump. You don't want to just have detail for the sake of detail, and you're sort of bogging down the story. And so, you try to balance that, right? So there's a lot of things that you leave out because you just need to keep going. And of course, everybody's of that time period. They understand how this, they understand what an ice box is. Well, okay, now in 2021, millennials probably have no idea why you call that an ice box. But you don't want to stop and explain, well, what is it? How that wasn't really a refrigerator. It was just like a friggin' big block of ice keeping stuff cold. And he had a drip pan. But so you try to kind of incorporate that in the narrative to the extent of, she reached down and changed the drip pan, but not really go out of your way to explain what that is, because my goodness, if you would just you would just lose yourself with too much detail.
And so this is a question from Erin Spapinato. She asks, do you see this book as speaking to the Black Gothic genre we've seen emerging in the last few years, speaking to texts like Lovecraft Country? I know the horror / superhero / noir genres are not the same, but they seem to speak to similar issues, as well as to a similar impulse to reclaim Black stories in genre fiction or narrative.
Yeah, I would say that the latter. I would say to reclaim Black stories in genre narratives, but certainly that's what that's what any, I think, writer of color does. If you're writing crime fiction, or if you're writing sci-fi, right? M.K. Jennison. If you're writing in these genres and you're using Black characters, you're using people of color characters, you're not. Hopefully, I'm not standing in a soapbox about it, but I'm also understanding that it is. This is set in 1928. I mean, the police have a certain relationship with the Black community now, let alone 1928. So even Henson is aware that he's a kind of big deal, but he's only a kind of big deal in the confines of Harlem. He understands that once he steps out of Harlem, he's just another black man taking his chances on a certain night or on a certain incident or a certain street. So even you know what I mean. So and he's a world traveler. He's seen other parts of the world, and so yes, to the extent that I think you have to, I'm telling you a fantastic story, or I'm telling you a story that has fantastic elements, but I'm also understanding that yes, as in Lovecraft Country, the specter of racism, the specter of race relationships, can't just can't be ignored. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no way to, I think, as I said, I'm not writing a treaty. I'm not writing, treaty. I'm not giving you a nonfiction essay on race. I'm giving you an adventure story, but I am giving you an adventure story about a black adventurer, which in fact, even of itself, has certain implications.
And now Manuel Ramos has asked, is there
Oh,
something about the current times that makes readers more open to new pulp writing and maybe writers more willing to explore the genre?
I know. Oh, thanks, Manuel. I know, Manuel. Uh, um, yeah, I think so. It's uh, it's a kind of interesting. Yeah, it is kind of interesting, right? Um, that new, well, as I said, new pulp came about partly just for practical reasons, which is to say, some of these characters had fallen into public domain, and so there's a sort of group of folks who've always been interested in these characters. But it's also the case that all of us are now in our current writing, for instance, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, even I don't write police procedures, but certainly the question came up. But police show up in my books now and then. So certainly the question of how do you portray the police? Well, it was already a question beforehand. It was already a question before that. It was before even Rodney King, before George Floyd. The question of how black writers portray cops, black, white, whatever, Latinx cops in the black community or other communities, you had to be cognizant of that, right? There was no way around that because I grew up in South Central, so that is going to come into play. So it is interesting that yes, all these kinds of sensibilities or these kind of attention to those kinds of points of view were invariably going to then play themselves out on the page, whether it's in genre fiction or so-called mainstream fiction. But certainly, as genre fiction has changed now from the days of Mickey Spillane and Mike Hammer, and I ain't got nothing against Mike Hammer. I read some Mike Hammer books, but those were certainly a certain kind of book, right? And certainly Spillane, consciously or unconsciously, spoke to the post-war white male, right, coming out of the war, coming out of that time period, setting in the 50s, anti-communism, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff plays out in the Mike Hammer books. How women are portrayed, right? All that stuff plays out in the Mike Hammer books. But it's also the case that if you were to take, and it has been done, a black woman detective, private eye in the 50s, well, that's a different story, isn't it? That's a different character. You couldn't, it would be too much of a parody, and weirdly so, if she was sitting there with her gun and whiskey in the drawer, which that's fine. She could have both those things, but she would certainly have a different perspective. I guess Mother's Brooklyn actually comes to mind than what we've seen heretofore. So yes, so obviously whatever the time period is, the fact that folks had points of view that weren't always talked about or weren't always expressed doesn't mean that they didn't exist, right? So now here's the chance to kind of explore that and bring that, as I said, from the background to the foreground.
And at the moment, does anybody else have? I feel like I'm asking an empty room because I can't see anyone. But does anyone have any more questions for Gary? I mean, I think we've had some really great questions and very,
Yeah,
it's been
I
a very
enjoyed it.
interesting evening.
It was.
So,
I thought so.
Gary, thank you very much. And
Well,
I
thanks
don't know.
for having me. This has been wonderful. And if you could send me those pictures, that'd be terrific.
Oh, yeah, yeah, because Donald McMillan, who was on that North Pole expedition, he kept going north, and he, of
Yes.
course, knew about both Peary and Henson's children, and so
Right.
he interacted with them, and we have photographs, and so
That's
yes,
wonderful.
yeah, he was Anauka was a very good-looking man, I must say,
Right. Right on.
and a
That's
successful
terrific.
hunter, and he had,
Right.
as you know, many descendants.
Right.
Oh, this is a thank you from Bernadette Ingolstadt. She says the Arctic may be filled with more characters for you, and I think there may
That's
indeed
right.
be more up there.
There you go.
Yeah, so, and I guess I just have one more question, which
Sure.
maybe you can't answer, I don't know. One of the things that struck me about the book is how great it would be as a film. I don't know if there's any of that in the offing, but
Well, we're trying. We're
yeah,
trying.
okay,
We'll,
yeah,
I think so. I think so too. So
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
We're trying.
Well, thank you very, very much. And I'll send you the photographs. We'll also
Oh,
send you your own little Matthew.
oh,
So he can be your mascot as you
that's
continue
it. That's
to
great.
work on these books. And I think we'll all look forward to reading them. The
Thanks,
coming
Genevieve. Thanks for having me. It's been a blast. It's been a
well,
blast.
good. Thank you very, very
All
much.
right. Okay,
Okay.
y'all.
Oh, wait, are there? I think we're
Oh,
getting, yes,
no,
thank yous.
there we
Yes,
go.
there's thank yous coming through.
All
Okay.
right, there you go.
All right.
Tell everybody thank
Yeah. Okay.
you.
All right.
All righty.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye now. Okay.
Yes.